on live stream. This is the Radioactive and Hazardous Materials Interim Committee. Thank you for joining us. I'm Representative Angelica Rubio. I serve in District 35, which is here in the city of Las Cruces. And I know that we have a really jam-packed agenda today, and so I wanted to certainly get us going. For those of you all who have questions, I know that there might be some moments where the hand raising might be difficult to use sometimes. So I'm going to be putting my cell phone number on the chat, and so in case you want to ask questions, feel free to text me if the hand is not working. Also, Shauna is available to help me keep track of that as well. So so just let me know when you need to speak, and I'll be sure to chime you in. Also, I just wanted to thank Shauna and the staff for working on finalizing the agenda and making sure that we all had all of the details that we needed to log in today. So thank you all for all of that, because I know that this is sort of a new age now for us in how we meet during the interim, and I know that moving into the legislative session in January, things might look a lot different as well. So I just want to I have a lot of love and appreciation for the staff who've been really working hard to make sure that we're all able to not only participate, but to have the public participate as well. Secondly, if you all are going to request per diem for today's webinar, please feel free to email Shauna as soon as possible so that she can get all of that information submitted. And so with that, does anybody have any questions before we get started? All right then. So Tom, if you're ready to move forward.
Okay, well, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Glad to be here to give you a bit of an update of what's going on with the laboratory in Los Alamos. The cover slide actually shows, our neighborhood. These are the counties in which the lab has the largest impact in terms of the work that we do, the employment, subcontracting, those sorts of things. Although obviously, we view ourselves as an important partner for the entire state. If you can go to the next slide, please. So just to give you some facts and figures for the current year, our fiscal year is the federal fiscal year, and it ends at the end of September. We will be over $3 billion in total funding received and work performed. As I'll show you, the laboratory budgets have been quite healthy over the past few years, and that shows up in a variety of different ways. Our payroll for this fiscal year will be around $1.3 billion, and our staff live in those counties that I showed you, predominantly in those counties that I showed you on the first view graph. We also do a lot of our work through subcontractors, and in fact, we're projecting that by the end of this fiscal year, at the end of the month, we will have awarded $440 million worth of contracts with New Mexico businesses, and that's an additional impact in terms of employment above and beyond those direct staff numbers that are shown there. And then a final element of our economic impact is through the payment of New Mexico gross receipts tax, and we're projecting that that'll come in over $100 million for 2020. Now, those numbers translate into jobs, both direct employees. We have about 13,000 employees at the lab, but then when you look at the knock-on effects in the subcontracting community and the general economic activity, it's around 24,000 jobs that are directly and indirectly created in the state as a result of all this activity. Because the budgets have been growing, we have been hiring over the past several years at a higher rate than maybe in years past. Around 1,000 people a year for the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, for the last fiscal year, we finished up at around 1,250 new employees. About half those employees are replacements for people who are retiring, just driven by the demographics of our workforce. And the other half of the new hires are associated with that growth that I discussed. And it looks like for the current fiscal year, we're on track to come in very close to that 1,250 number that we had last year, which was actually a kind of a record in certainly within the last 30 years that we looked back over in terms of the rate of hiring. If we look at our current employees, about 40% of them are from New Mexico. One of the things we've been working on recently, and I'll talk about this a little bit when I get to the discussion of some of the work we're doing in workforce development, is developing partnerships with local educational institutions focused on skills that we need, with the goal of increasing the amount of hiring we're doing in the community that we live in. And in that context, I'm happy to say that in the past year, about 3/4 of our employees hailed from New Mexico. So we're making, I think, good progress in that area. If you can go to the next slide. Of course, the other sort of impact that we have that goes beyond just our kind of operational activities as a federal lab is our engagement in the community. And this takes a variety of forms. Our employees are themselves, passionate about the communities they live in and the causes to which they are aligned. And we have a payroll donation campaign. And about 90% of the employee giving in that campaign stays within local nonprofits in that region surrounding the lab. We've actually tried to incentivize that by taking the match that we provide, Triad, as the operating contractor for Los Alamos, and matching contributions 50 cents on the dollar for nonprofits that are in that 7-county region that most of our employees live in. As a result, about $2.5 million was donated through the last campaign, and of course we'll be going into the next campaign shortly. A lot of our philanthropic activities, not surprisingly, recently have been focused on the challenges associated with COVID. Obviously, that's had, although we are fortunate at Los Alamos that we're still all employed and have important national security work to carry on. That's not true in the communities around us, and so we've shifted some of our philanthropic activities to support regional community foundations, rural health clinics, Pueblo Refund, and the Food Depot, organizations that are helping in that broader response to the economic hardship that's been created by the pandemic. For many years, there has been a Los Alamos Employee Scholarship Fund, and in 2020, that awarded around $750,000 of scholarships to students from throughout northern New Mexico. One thing that we're very excited about is the expansion of something called the Poake Project, that was an effort to look at ways to more effectively educate in some of the STEM disciplines. And due to some state investment, this is being expanded now to some nearby school systems. And we hope that that can be a model for New Mexico as a whole in terms of the support that it provides to teachers in these critical areas. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that one of the things that we're focused on is the hiring that comes from the turnover of retiring staff and the growth that we're experienced, and trying to work with local educational institutions to make sure we have that workforce pipeline with the right sort of critical skills to address our needs. And this gives you a couple of examples of things that we have done recently that I think are contributing to our success in terms of being able to recruit more New Mexicans into the very good jobs that we are fortunate to be able to offer. So one example is an effort with Northern New Mexico College. You can actually see a picture of the billboard that's on the stretch of highway between Poake and Los Alamos. for radiation control technicians. So this is an associate's degree in radiation protection. There's a cohort of 40 students enrolled. We started this around 2 years ago. It's already having a positive impact in terms of our ability to recruit and retain in this really critical area for our operations. And we're seeing benefits in terms of actually improvements in our operational efficiency because of the stabilization of the workforce in this area and the support for the future growth. More recent development, we announced a little while ago a new program with Santa Fe Community College. Actually, this is focused on machining, which is another of those critical skills that we need, and will provide, similar to the Northern New Mexico effort, internships at the lab. Get practical hands-on experience, and we think that this will be every bit as successful as the RCT program that's been running for a little while. Another area where we have needs is in the skilled trades, in the crafts, and there we're partnering with some high schools and the New Mexico Building and Construction Trades Council in order to line up students with automatic interviews and the opportunities for employment at the lab, given the significant efforts that we have in some of the infrastructure revitalization that we're undertaking. And a final example is a program that we're working on with UNM Los Alamos, which will allow laboratory employees who have already a 2-year associate's degree to, while they're working, take on the additional courses that are necessary to turn that into a 4-year bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. So upskilling those employees who are already on staff and doing it in a way where they can continue to, be employed and have a paycheck, but at the same time, they're opening up additional opportunities for future advancement. So those are just a couple of examples of the things that we're doing. And it's been really very gratifying, the response that we've received from the educational institutions in our region who have been not only willing, but really eager to tailor programs to meet the particular workforce needs that we have during this time of really sustained growth for the laboratory. Could you turn to the next view graph now, please? I want to say a little bit about COVID-19 because obviously that has been, the overwhelming thing we're all facing as we try and adapt to the challenges imposed by this tragedy. I am pleased to say that the policies that we have implemented in the workplace for those activities that require on-site presence. Of course, the biggest policy is most people are actually teleworking, which really minimizes the risk, just as we're doing in this discussion now. But for those employees who have to be on site because of the nature of their work, everything from wearing masks, social distancing, engineered controls, things like plastic plexiglass shields, keeping the numbers of people on site down to an absolute minimum, have been successful so far in preventing the laboratory from being a significant vector for transmission. There are a total of 55 cases among lab employees, subcontractors, and actually that number also includes our colleagues in the environmental management program. You'll get a chance to hear from EM, as we call it, next, I think. And I think 48 of the cases are actually laboratory employees or subcontractors as of September 4th. And that's true through to this morning now. So we've had to update our policies, our protocols, our tools to help enable remote work. We've tried to be as flexible as we can, particularly recognizing the challenges that many working parents have with their kids in distance learning mode. We've been doing things like providing remote ergonomic evaluations for home offices to make sure that we don't have concerns associated with repetitive stress injuries because people aren't at their normal workstations, and also making sure that we have the right IT tools in terms of hardware and software to allow for remote work to be done efficiently and effectively. And so all of these things have been very helpful in allowing us to both sustain our important national security missions and ensure that our staff, their families, and their communities remain safe. If you can go to the next view graph, please. In terms of the environmental and safety responsibilities that are obviously one of the primary areas of focus of this committee, first thing that's important to state is that even though we've implemented this maximum telework policy and the majority of our staff are working from home, we have been able throughout the pandemic, really since March, to continue our mission essential national security activities that required on-site presence, and also continuously maintain the safety, security, environmental compliance of all of our facilities. So at no time have we had to stand down anything to do with safety, security, environment, or those critical national security missions that have been identified by the National Nuclear Security Administration. And as an organization that's always striving to improve, learn from what happens and avoid repeated events, we're obviously employing that now in terms of things that have occurred that we've been able to look at, scrutinize, and understand. I'll talk a little bit about some of those because although we're very focused on the risks associated with COVID and virus transmission, that does not mean that the risks that we traditionally have to manage in terms of worker safety and the environment have in any way disappeared. And our environmental groups have been working with our neighbors in the neighboring pueblos, the counties, other local entities to make sure that we're preserving those important biological and cultural resources that surround us and staying compliant with all the state and federal requirements associated with our operations. And throughout, our priority has been to protect our employees, the public, and the environment. If you could go to the next slide, please. As I said, just because we're worried about a virus doesn't mean we don't have to be focused on the traditional hazards that we normally encounter. And we've seen some examples as hands-on work ramped back up again after an initial period where we sort of paused to readjust and develop the protocols for working in a COVID environment. We did have some incidents that were a concern that gave us opportunities to learn from them. There were a couple that were, in fact, you may have read in some of the local papers about exposure to contamination going on for work that was carried on in a glove box. So we have a few examples of these sorts of things. There's a picture in the upper right-hand corner that shows the small breach in the glove that was associated from one of those events. It's not that unusual for gloves to wear out. That's something that can occur. So the really important thing is how the staff respond in order to avoid unintended contamination. And I think we learned from this event some things that I think are maybe well understood by experienced staff, but because of a lot of the hiring we've been doing, it's very important that those sort of practices that are ingrained in people with years of experience get properly handed on to new employees as they come in. And so that's certainly something that we're focused on. Another example in a different area is associated with hoisting and rigging and electrical safety. The photograph in the bottom right shows a rigging fixture that failed. In these cases, we didn't have any injuries, but one of the things that's really important is that actually when something happens that's not expected, even if no one is injured, even if there's not a significant radiological uptake, we want to do everything that we can to really view that near miss as a gift that we've been given where we've discovered a weakness in the system, something that we can improve so that it doesn't occur again when in a different set of circumstances, it could have resulted in an injury. And so those are just a couple of examples there. Next view graph, please. So I mentioned that the lab has been growing, and what this chart shows is the budget over the last several years. You can see it's been on a fairly steady upward ramp, getting to about $3 billion for the current fiscal year. Of course, we don't know precisely what's going to happen in the future, but there's a very strong budget request for FY21 that's currently under consideration in Washington. Those of you who know the system will recognize that we're actually getting pretty close to the end of fiscal year, so we're hoping that something will happen before too long about a budget for October. And that significant increase, which is close to $1 billion, is associated with a lot of the needs associated with our expanded mission, with things like pit production ramping up, and also the revitalization of some of our infrastructure in support of our current missions. Many of our facilities are, past the point where they're in need of either significant, renovation and upgrading, improvement to modern specifications, or outright replacement. And that's a big driver for that increase that's, as I said, in the budget request. In the following years, things kind of level off. And what happens kind of underneath those numbers is a shift from an initial focus on infrastructure investments to eventually ramping up the operations in new and improved facilities. And so we're eagerly awaiting the results of the budget discussions to find out if this general trend that we've seen over the last several years of increasing budgets will be sustained in the next fiscal year. Next view graph. I mentioned the infrastructure, and we really have a pretty significant challenge, actually, due to facility conditions and a lack of space. Because of the hiring that we've been doing up until the pandemic set in, we had many of our staff doubled and tripled up in offices, and in some cases we are occupying facilities that are really well past the point where they should be in service. There was a lot of investment in the laboratory during the post-war Cold War era, but those facilities have served their country well and are now ready for a well-deserved retirement. And so we've got a lot of work to really modernize our campus, make it fit for purpose for the 21st century. There's a lot that's already underway, things that are nearing completion, things that are in the planning, the design stage. A couple of examples: we've got 3 new cell towers that are just in the process of being completed that I think will greatly improve our ability to communicate over a pretty large distributed campus where we conduct our R&D activities. The bottom right-hand corner shows a picture of a modular office building that's actually under construction in the administrative region of the lab. We have a secure facility that was recently dedicated. We had a ribbon cutting for it. Some parking garages to deal with the other side of the space crunch. If everyone's doubled up and tripled up in offices, you can probably guess that parking is in high demand as well. So we're building 2 new parking garages. We built a new enclosure to allow us to conduct experiments at DART without having to be concerned about things like ice and snow and so forth that create hazards in accessing the facility. And that's now complete. We're also in the process of reconfiguring some of our facilities to create more collaborative and teleworking spaces. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because we've learned a lot from necessity how to get work done remotely. And we believe this may be something that can be a tool for the future as well. We're still challenged in terms of craft availability for supporting this construction work. And that's one of the reasons why we've instituted some of those programs that I mentioned, working with area high schools to help meet those needs. Next view graph, please. So as I said, COVID has actually driven us to shift a large fraction of our employees to telework. At the peak, we had over 10,000 employees who were working remotely. in many areas, we have found this to be very effective. Now, not everything can be done remotely. We're not doing machining or chemistry in people's garages. And obviously, a lot of the work that we do is classified, and that's not something that can be done from home. But there are a lot of activities, particularly in some of the open science areas, in some of our business, human resources, procurement, those kinds of things, where employees can be really fully effective in a telework mode. And of course, we're going to have to continue to sustain this until there's either widespread availability of an effective vaccine combined with better treatment, so that we can no longer be concerned about COVID. And of course, nobody's really sure exactly when that point in time will be, but it's definitely measured in months, not weeks. So, as I said, we're seriously considering longer-term teleworking options, moving out beyond COVID, at least for those activities that can be performed effectively. And so we're converting some of our office facilities into what we're calling teleworking hubs, which would be an on-site base for people who might be teleworking at least a portion of the time, but they need a place to have group meetings for that all-important human interaction that we're all missing, and also to store files and those kinds of things. And in addition, we're currently exploring lease options across a wider geographic footprint than the lab is traditionally considered. So we're looking within a 50-mile radius of Los Alamos. So this would include, for example, Espanola, Santa Fe, places that are nearby, actually near where many of our employees live, since about 60% of our staff actually live outside Los Alamos County. And so we're hoping that we could accommodate somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 employees through this offsite lease, which could also include Los Alamos County. It's an open solicitation. I can't give too much detail about that because it's an active procurement, but we're pretty hopeful that we're going to be able to find some good options working with the private sector, with property owners. Next view graph, please. And one thing that is, I think, a good example of why there are institutions like Los Alamos National Lab has been our role in supporting the response to COVID. Now, obviously, we've had to respond in terms of how we operate the lab, but we're also playing a leadership role in some of the innovation that's underway across the country to tackle this pandemic. There's a total of $18 million, both internal laboratory funds and fundings that we've received through, for example, the CARES Act that was passed by Congress to understand and respond to the virus. This is being performed under the umbrella of something called the National Virtual Biotechnology Lab, which is really a consortium of DOE labs. Los Alamos is leading a COVID testing team. This has actually turned out to be operationally very important for us because we've developed drone testing capability. We're testing about 400 employees a week, and we're hoping to ramp that up to 1,000 employees a week in October. And this is allowing us to respond when there are possible cases of COVID. People may have symptoms, and also do testing of asymptomatic employees to screen, since one of the challenges with COVID is that you can actually have the disease and be infectious without realizing it. And so the test is really the only way to identify that. We've also been very active in the modeling and forecasting area. Our COVID-19 model is available on the Biosurveillance Gateway website. It's cited by the CDC. It's also been a resource for the state. We've been working quite closely with the state, doing things like projecting disease transmission out 4 to 6 weeks and providing analysis to support the important decisions that the state has had to make in terms of school reopenings and what different scenarios might mean in terms of the spread of the disease. And we're also providing work in improving ventilator performance and understanding how those devices work and can be improved in terms of therapeutic outcomes. in close collaboration with the private sector. Okay, next view graph. So I think that was what I had to say, and turn it back to you, Madam Chairman. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So far, we have a couple people on the list. First, we have Representative Chandler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can everyone hear me? Okay, very good. Thank you, Dr. Mason, for sharing all that useful and informative information with us. We really appreciate your time and effort in being here. So I have a few kind of diverse kinds of questions, Madam Chair and Speaker, so I hope you'll bear with me a little bit. First, I'd like to ask you about the status of the site plan. I think a few last year or so, I think Mr. Beyerschmidt was here, and I asked him about it, and I was expecting that the plan would be completed and we would have access to have a better understanding of how the site was being developed and so on. So perhaps Dr. Mason could share some information with us on that point.
Sure. So one of the things we've been working on, and Kelly Beyerschmidt, who you mentioned, has been kind of the one driving this, is doing an integrated site plan that brings together all the different elements of infrastructure revitalization. And so this includes, it's actually, because it's a bunch of different pieces, that's reflected in a series of different things. So it includes, for example, the leasing that I mentioned. We're seeking leases for additional space, maintenance and refurbishment of additional space, infrastructure investments from the infrastructure program at NSA, and capital projects, which are, major line items. Probably the best kind of integrated picture of all of that is something which we affectionately call the FinSIP, which is, in true government bureaucracy form, an acronym that stands for Future Years Nuclear Security Program. That's actually a publicly available document that we'd be happy to provide to the committee, and it gives a pretty complete cataloging of all the planned infrastructure investments across all those different categories that I mentioned. So that's really the place where it comes together, and we'd be happy to provide that to the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Dr. Mason, for that answer. I'm just still a little confused because there was this grand document that was being presented at various times and discussed, and now I guess what I'm hearing is that's not a document that's going to be produced.
Well, the FinSIP is something that's produced every year by NNSA that covers all of the sites, including Los Alamos. And that's really the one place that I think what you're looking for is the integrated picture of all these different pieces that I mentioned. And the FinSIP is really the best place to find that.
Okay. But what is the status of the site plan?
Well, as I said, we have a number of facilities that we've completed. We have facilities that are under construction and more that are in the planning phases. So it's sort of a living, breathing thing that we're executing against at the moment. Things like the parking garages that I showed you, the office buildings, and the leasing.
All right, I'll move on, Madam Chair. I'm just confused, Madam Chair, because there has been a lot of talk about the site plan, and now I'm hearing that there really isn't a site plan. There's a collection of things that one could call a site plan. Did I get that correct, Dr. Mason? There's
a series of different planned activities, and the roll-up, the integrated view, which as I interpret your question, is the thing that you're looking for, is reflected in this so-called FinSIP. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, could you talk a little bit about the role of Sandia and in the weapons program, your working relationship, the lab's working relationship with Sandia, and how the two labs interact. We don't talk very much about Sandia at these meetings, and I wanted to elevate their role because they do a lot of excellent work, Madam Chair, in terms of the weapons program as well as national security. And I thought maybe this would start a conversation about how we can start talking a little bit more about Sandia's very fine work as well.
Sure. Madam Chairman, Representative Chandler, thanks for the question. Sandia is a long-standing sister institution to Los Alamos. In fact, it started out as a division of Los Alamos at Kirtland Air Force Base in the 40s.
Can anyone hear Dr. Mason?
Yeah, I think we lost Dr. Mason. We'll try to get him back on. But just in the meantime, Representative, I did let Shauna know about the Sandia piece, and so we're going to try to add it to the agenda next month. And Dr. Mason, you're back.
Okay, sorry about that. My camera just decided to go to sleep, so I guess I wasn't moving enough or something. Thank you, Chair and Representative Chandler. Sandia is, of course, a sister institution to Los Alamos. In fact, it started out as a division of the laboratory at Kirtland Air Force Base in the 40s and then became a separate laboratory. Its primary mission focus is on the non-nuclear components of the nuclear deterrent. And so we have to work very closely with them because Los Alamos is the design lab for what we call the physics components, and Sandia does the rest of that system design. So there's a very tight integration in terms of our nuclear deterrence mission. They share also in the activities in support of nuclear nonproliferation, as well as the science and energy portfolio that are part of the mix here at Los Alamos. New Mexico is certainly fortunate to have two of the, in fact, largest research institutions in the world located in the state. Roughly speaking, and this is a bit of a caricature, but Los Alamos is more of a science lab and Sandia is more of an engineering lab. It's not to say Sandia does great science and we do great engineering, but that's the kind of thumbnail sketch.
And Madam Chair and Dr. Sandia also has a testing piece out in California, does it not? There is a small component of Sandia in California.
Madam Chair, Representative Chandler, yes, in fact, Sandia has a site at Livermore, and just as they work with Los Alamos on components of the deterrent that Los Alamos is responsible for, they have to work with Livermore on those systems that Livermore is responsible for. So they have a fairly significant presence in Livermore in California as well. They're spread across. That's why it's Sandia National Laboratories, plural, and we are Los Alamos National Laboratory, singular.
Thank you for that answer. I never knew that, and I've been involved with the lab since 1986 in some way, either as a community member or as an employee. So that's a piece of information I had not known. Shifting gears, Madam Chair. Doctor, I understand that the lab is not responsible for the EIS process or decisions about the EIS process, but could you just give all of us an update as to what is going on with the site-wide EIS, if anything, and just a general update on that? I'm sure you know what is going on.
Yeah, this site-wide EIS, of course, is quite distinct from the recent record of decision that was specifically focused on the pit production activities. The site-wide EIS is something which each of the NNSA sites undertakes on a regular basis. In fact, right now, Livermore is just beginning the public process of their SWICE, as it's called. We are starting at the laboratory to begin our own internal discussions to get ready for the next cycle that we will be on, which I would anticipate will actually be getting started probably before too long, just as part of that normal refresh that has to happen because, things evolve over the course of a decade or so.
Madam Chair and Dr. Mason, when you say that the lab is discussing the next step in its site-wide, that won't necessarily lead to a full-blown site-wide, will it? There's an evaluation process before one does that. I'm trying to I don't want the public to assume there will be a full-blown site-wide unless that is indeed likely sense of that.
Yeah, at this stage, you know, as you mentioned, the whole NEPA process is really something that's a federal thing, and our role is to provide input to that. So all we're doing at the moment is internally having those discussions to be ready in anticipation of what could be, you know, a federal request. So we're just trying to get our ducks in a row.
I didn't hear there for a second, but that's okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Mason, for your answers. I really appreciate Triad's role, prominent role in the region. As I said earlier, I had some kind of a connection with the lab since 1986, and so I have had interactions with 3 different contractors now, starting with the university. And so Triad is my 3rd. And I think I can say fairly that Triad seems to have made the greatest inroads in integrating with northern New Mexico. That's my observation. And what I'm most excited is about the educational programs that Triad has been spearheading and the partnership that Triad's been developing with our local colleges and community colleges, developing trade programs and engineering programs. I think that's fabulous, and I think it's not just fabulous for the lab, but it's also fabulous for the local communities, and it gives our young people opportunities and career paths at the lab that is sorely needed and very, very important for those individuals and their families. So that I'm thrilled about. I think that's great. My one disappointment is I really feel we need more transparency in terms of what is being envisioned for the lab's development. I hear a lot from my constituents, and maybe others do as well, that they support the lab, they want the lab in the region, but they would like more information about the $1 billion that's going into this year, into the infrastructure and those kinds of things. And that's why I pressed on the site plan issue, Madam Chair and Doctor. It would be very helpful if people had, even if it was a 5-page summary about the various activities that are planned for the next 5 years, redevelopment of the campus, program mix, all of that kind of thing, because I get a lot of questions about it. And truthfully, as someone who lives in Los Alamos, I'm not sure I have a good handle on it. So with that gentle criticism, I appreciate your presentation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Next on the list, we have Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and good morning, Dr. Mason. Thank you for your presentation and all your work. I do want a little bit more information on this pit production stuff we're talking about. I know you had a headline there on your presentation under environmental safety and responsibilities. And then you also talked about a little bit about that under the preparing for continued growth. And I thank our representative for Chandler for asking the questions she did, but I have a little more of a quest for deeper information. When you mentioned that you are looking at having discussions now for what could be requested later by the federal government and so on, it struck a question in my mind. What are these discussions leading to? Are we looking at doing what we call, you said ECIS. I don't understand acronyms too well. I know what an environmental impact statement is, so I kind of, to me, that is EIS, and you know, on and on. But if I have one more letter there, I'm losing. So thank you. I would assume that means the same thing. And if it isn't, please correct me. But my question has to do with environmental impact.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Madam Chair and Senator. there's really two distinct things. There's a specific record of decision that has been rendered regarding pit production. And then the question that Dr. Chandler was asking regarded something called a site-wide environmental impact statement. SWICE is I mentioned we love acronyms. So the record of decision was focused specifically on previously through NEPA, there was an authorization to produce 20 pits per year, and we're now being asked by the federal government to go to 30 pits per year. And so that has gone through the process. The site-wide environmental impact statement, or SWICE, is something which, as I mentioned, all the sites on some periodic basis will go through that process, and that looks at the full scope of the operations. So not just pit production, but all the other things that we do, and what the plans are for that going forward. And that's not something that's underway at the moment. And as was mentioned, that's sort of a federal process that we would provide support for. And what we're doing at the moment is just in anticipation of the fact that we'll probably be coming back into that cycle for the laboratory to do an update. We're starting to, have our own, preparatory work in anticipation that we might get that request. But there's nothing that's formally underway at the moment along those lines. It's just that we're probably about due for it.
I see. In that request that you're making, Madam Chairman, Dr. Mason, in that anticipation, do you anticipate a full environmental impact analysis to see how and where and to what extent it is going to impact our environment? I look at it, Dr. Mason, because I know that in the 90s there was pit production that to this date we have not fully resolved those issues. And then also the fact that we're in a fault zone in Los Alamos, and we just had a 3.7 earthquake there this year in the Hemis. And so all these things just come to my mind as we're looking at these environmental impact statements.
Yeah. So, a lot of the specifics of things like, seismic or fire safety or radiological safety, those are really part of the, safety basis for our operating facilities, whether it's the PF4 facility or Lance accelerators and so forth. A site-wide environmental impact statement is intended to look at the full, everything that goes on the site. So that would include certainly those facilities. It would also include, office facilities, traffic associated with commuting, our future energy needs, and how we'd be meeting those. What are the environmental impacts of them? So it's intended to be a much more comprehensive analysis of the full range of environmental impacts associated with the, all 13,000 employees and everything that they do every day, and what the plans are for the future. So it's a more comprehensive than, a particular safety analysis for a particular facility against a particular hazard, which is something that we have to do as part of our safety basis and approval for operations.
I see. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mason. And one final question, Madam Chairman, and I'm going to move on because I know others may have questions too, and we have a long agenda. But you mentioned, Dr. Mason, that initially there were requests for 20 pits and per year, and then the feds now want 30, for example. And was any environmental impact statement requested already, or any analysis or discussions having to do with the initial 20 before we move to the 30, or is it like all in one?
No, the 20 pit per year was the prior limit under the prior NEPA process. So up until very recently, we had the authorization through the NEPA process to make 20 pits per year, and have been making pits. I mean, we're making pits now, not what's called war reserve, but development pits. And there was a period of time in the mid 2000s when we were making pits at an elevated level, and that was subject of a prior analysis. So what was done recently was to look and see whether or not there would be any significant impact from an environmental point of view of basically going from 20 pits per year to 30 pits per year. And there was a process of public consultation that went around that, and input was received. And in the end, NNSA reached the determination that there was not a significant impact of going from 20 to 30 pits per year. It's not a new activity for the lab. The waste forms are consistent with the things that we have been handling and dealing with in the past. And so that was the thing that resulted in the so-called record of decision that occurred recently.
I see. Okay. At some point, I suppose that you will have the more public input and consultation as you continue forward with this.
Well, certainly, if we go into a site-wide EIS process in the future, that, as I said, that'll involve a much more comprehensive analysis of everything that the lab does, and it also provides for public input, as the process did, leading to the record of decision to approve the 30 pits per year.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman. That's all I have. Thank you, Dr. Mason.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we have Senator Kernan.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Mason, when you talk about the ESI, or the environmental impact statement, who does that for the lab? Would that be the NNSA or the NRC? Who's responsible for that ESI?
Yeah, Madam Chair and Senator, that is the National Nuclear Security Administration. So that's a federal process. We provide, obviously, technical input to that, but it's really NNSA that has the responsibility as the responsible government agency for our activities, who kind of shepherds that through the process and ultimately renders the decision.
And so, Madam Chair, would you agree then, Dr. Mason, that once that impact statement is complete and presented, does the community generally consider that sufficient evidence that it's okay to move ahead with whatever new project or with what you're doing currently, once that has been delivered with community input? How does the community respond to the results of those?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why there is extensive public consultation through that NEPA process. Now, obviously, there's a wide spectrum of views in the community, and some people may be more comfortable with that process than others. But I think in general, once a record of decision has been reached through that public consultation process, that generally the view is that there's been a thorough analysis and discussion of the issues and the alternatives, and I think for the most part people feel pretty comfortable that we have a very rigorous legal mechanism for dealing with these kinds of things.
So thank you very much, and I think that gives everyone confidence, knowing that once that very detailed process has been completed and approved. I hope we all remember that as a committee. So I want to move forward. You mentioned in your presentation about your participation in the modeling and the forecasting and the plan for reopening schools. I know that you've worked very closely, probably with Dr. Scrace. Members of our community, legislators from Southeast New Mexico, recently met with Dr. Scrace online, and we had a lot of questions about the modeling and about how they have reached some of the decisions that they have made regarding school reopening. In kind of a layman's term, can you just briefly talk about what your role has been, what you have particularly looked at as a lab and recommended to Dr. Scrace and to the governor with regard to the school reopening, and how that line was drawn basically in the sand to say, all right, if you're here, you can reopen, if you're not, and what factors were taken into consideration? If you can talk about that in a way that we can understand, because I know it's very complex.
Sure, Madam Chair and Senator, I'd be happy to talk about that. I think, in fact, I was, very honored recently. Dr. Scrace and I, along with the Presbyterian Health, actually published an op-ed in many newspapers in New Mexico that talked a little bit about this partnership that's been struck between state government. Obviously, we're a federal institution, Presbyterian. You have a major healthcare provider. And I think that the first and probably one of the most important points to make is that obviously at Los Alamos we're not in the position of running schools and making day-to-day decisions about those sorts of things. That's something that the state government has a responsibility for. Our role has been to provide analysis to inform their decision making. So we're not in a position to kind of say you should or should not do this. What we can do is provide some rigorous analysis of what's likely to happen under different scenarios for their consideration. And in fact, the lab has been involved in infectious disease modeling going back to the 70s. We've had built up over the decades expertise because of the profound national security implications, which we're really seeing real time today with COVID-19. So we've had people involved previously with modeling H1N1, Ebola, and so forth. And so we have a lot of tools that are actually similar to some of the tools we use for our responsibilities in the area of nuclear deterrence in terms of using high-performance computing and modeling and simulation to make forecasts of how the spread may evolve over the coming weeks. And that can be useful for the state if they're trying to plan, okay, what do we project the need is for intensive care beds or ventilators? And, what's happening in different regions of the state that might mean we need to reposition patients or equipment. In terms of the school restart, we can apply some of those modeling tools to looking at things like this so-called hybrid scenario, where you have students in school physically for part of the week and at home part of the week to keep the density down. How does that compare to what we would love to be able to do, everyone going back to school full time versus staying at home 100% of the time, which has potentially some educational consequences. So those projections can allow the state, I think, to make a better judgment of, how do we trade off the risks associated with returning to face-to-face in terms of disease propagation versus the benefits that students will get by having that in-classroom experience. And so, I'm a firm believer that we make better decisions when we have good data. And we're fortunate that we have a modeling group that's second to none. And, models aren't perfect, but actually through close coordination with the state and input that we've been able to get in terms of where the disease is occurring, we've got a pretty good model location by location of population density, disease incidence, and it gives us an ability to look a little bit forward. And it's been pretty close to the mark in terms of, as I said, really that 4 to 6 week time frame, and more recently, this kind of scenario modeling for the school. So I'm pleased that we've been able to support the state in this. And I think, one of the points that we tried to make in the op-ed that we published is that I think it's been an advantage for the state of New Mexico to have the kind of partnerships, not just with Los Alamos, but with Sandia, who we talked about before, and also the healthcare providers. And that's probably one of the reasons that the state has been doing, relatively well compared to some other jurisdictions is that they've been able to tap these resources.
Thank you very much for that. And there are a couple of things that I think with regard to Southeast New Mexico, and I think, as you know, all the school districts all around the state have been allowed to go to the hybrid model, except for Southeast New Mexico. And so one of the things that we visited with Dr. Scrace about was the fact that 58% of our workers are considered, we have 58% considered essential workers. So that's higher than most counties and most locations. We've been out since the beginning of this, and people have been working, and basically we've not been able to reduce that number, and they're out working. So is that type of thing included in the modeling with regard to comparing county by county or region by region, the number of essential workers that are required to be out? And does that have an impact on the fact that maybe the numbers are a little bit higher in one area because of that one factor? Is that part of what you look at?
The modeling doesn't, it more just looks at what are the patterns of disease progression given the conditions that exist in the communities, and tries to project under the assumption that, you know, if things have been getting better, they're going to continue to get better. This, you know, mask wearing, social distancing, whatever. If they've been getting worse, they'll kind of continue. So it's not, it's more of a, the way that the group doing the work describes it, it's actually more of a forecast than a model. So it's taking the real world conditions as they exist, which would include the factors that you talked about if they varied from region to region.
So with mask wearing, when you talk about mask wearing, how do you make that determination from a region if there is mask wearing or not?
It just looks at the data.
So how is that? I don't understand how. Where do you get the data to determine whether masks are being worn? Are you assuming that because masks are being worn or not being worn, how does that impact?
Well, it's looking at the data of the propagation of the disease.
So you're assuming that because there was no mask wearing, or there is, I don't understand how you incorporate the mask wearing. That would be, I don't understand if, Madam Chair, if it's mask wearing, is it groups gathering, is it essential workers, is it because we're on the border and people travel back and forth daily from one side of the border to the next, or any of those factors? How do you define that, and how do you really secure that information and that data?
So the models don't try and make assumptions about whether people might or might not be wearing masks, or whether there's a high degree of essential work or travel. It's actually just taking the understanding of the propagation of the disease and the observed data about what's been happening. So if many people are wearing masks and socially distancing, and the disease is attenuating, then it will project that trend on into the future. So it does not try and anticipate, you know, if there's a policy change at some point in time in the future, you know, what impact is that going to have? It's just driven by the observed data. And in that respect, it's a little bit different than some of the other models that are talked about, where people try and, you know, say, well, what happens if more people wear masks or less people wear masks? This is just driven by the observations. And I think that's one reason why it's proven to be fairly accurate, because it's not making assumptions, but it's also a reason why it doesn't go too far into the future. It's just this 4 to 6 week window.
So, Madam Chair, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much longer, but the data is really important, because it has been presented as a reason why one area of the state is not allowed to open. So when we look at the differences in the diversity among different areas, and then that decision, that line is drawn in the sand, if you don't meet this criteria. So we still question, and we have concerns in this part of the state with regard to that. And I know they've moved from a 7-day rolling average to a 14-day. I don't know how that's going to impact. I know our hospitalizations have been very low. So it's very concerning. And I think I know you mentioned in your conversation about the toll that it's taking on our students, but I don't think that that's really incorporated in the data. That seems to be just something that you take the data, but that's really not something that you all incorporate in your modeling, is because there would be no way for you to know. It's all anecdotal. And we hear what we hear, and we know what we know, but it's not really part of the modeling. Is that correct? The human toll?
That's correct. Our models are simply providing to the state our best estimate of how things will change with respect to the disease. And it's really the state's call how to factor that in, weigh all the different, we're trying to provide the best data we can so that as they do that kind of important decision making that is the responsibility they're charged with, they have this as an input. It's not something that we try, and it's not our role to make that call for the state.
And I appreciate that, Madam Chair. And you're talking about forecasting where the decision to not allow Southeast New Mexico to open, in spite of the fact that 75% of our teachers are ready to go back in person, 68% of our parents are ready to send their children back, and right across the border in Seminole, Texas, they're wide open. And basically, I checked today, they had 0 cases increase today. So, it's very confusing to us. We're not happy. We are hopeful that someone will begin to look at the human toll that this is taking on our kiddos. And I understand and appreciate that that's really not the role. And I acknowledge that. But I think we need to figure out how to secure some data with regard to the human impact of our children not being able to be with their peers. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Kernan. Finally, we have Senator Steinborn, and we're moving into, we were scheduled to have a break, and so the next panel will start at 11:15. So just an FYI, Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. Mason, good morning. Good morning, everybody. So when we have these conversations, my focus generally deals with the safety issues for the laboratory and for the community at large and for the workers. And so I want to follow up on a few issues there, Dr. Mason. And I know when you first spoke to the committee after you took over, you mentioned that safety was your first mission to evaluate. And obviously the previous contractor had a lot of problems in that regard and expedited their removal, I suppose, if that's a fair way to say it. So when you had mentioned in your testimony that pit production has been ongoing, when did it resume? Because it had stopped for a while, no?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Senator Steinborn, thanks for the question. Yeah, there had been, prior to Triad taking over, there had been a pause of operations in the PF4 facility, which is where the pit production work is predominantly carried out. And the activities had begun to resume in PF4 prior to Triad assuming responsibility for the contract in November 2018. But obviously, since we came in, this has been a strong focus area, as you said, making sure that we can, operate safely and meet our mission needs. And so we have resumed pit production activities. As I said, the pits that we're making at the moment are what are called development pits because we're still working closely with our partners at Livermore on the requirements. So we're proving out the processes, the new equipment that's been installed. We're scheduled to make the first production unit, so-called War Reserve, in 2023, and to get to 30 pits per year by 2026. So those are the objectives that we have laid out, and we have been making steady progress against that. And that's been enabled by the progress we've been making actually in areas to do with safety, security, and environment. So for example, in the last year, we have removed 1,500 drums of waste from the PF4 facility that had accumulated during that period where activities were suspended. And so resuming those waste shipments has been absolutely critical to getting back into an operational mode.
Okay. Thank you. And, it seems like previously one of the limiting factors, frankly, was the amount of inspectors, that the lab was short on the amount of inspectors. Is that the case? Is that still the case?
So thank you for the question, Madam Chair, Senator Steinborn. There have been a number of areas that we've had some shortages of critical skills. And that's one of the reasons we've been working on some of these educational programs. So there are some pretty specialized skill sets that are needed. You mentioned, inspectors, quality assurance is certainly one of them. Criticality safety, radiation control technicians. These are all areas that we've been working very hard with educational institutions and have had, I think we're starting to see some success in terms of a more robust pipeline for people with those skills. We also have a significant internship program that introduces people to the lab as part of their educational experience that also helps us in some of those areas.
Sure.
And the hiring that I mentioned is that, buried in those numbers I told you in terms of the hiring has been plugging some of those gaps. We still have areas that we have challenges. I mentioned the new machinist program. That's one where we've still got a shortage of qualified people. And so we've got more work to do in that area.
Sure. Well, and I just want to add, I am also a little concerned that that the decision was made to not do an EIS or a review on the expanded pit production. We shouldn't gloss over the challenges that remain and the safety issues that remain, and it's inherently difficult, challenging work. It's, we appreciate that. Of course, we know, and you mentioned it, that recently 15 workers were exposed and were tested for exposure, and it's not been made public whether or not anyone was impacted or tested positive for radiation exposure. But you mentioned that gloves wear out. That's not that rare. I was kind of shocked when I heard you say that, because it would seem to me that these would be things that we would change out regularly, especially if we know they wear out, and that could lead to population of people being exposed. And that's from a layman's standpoint, listening to that comment. But and I'll just say at this point, Madam Chair, I'm a fan of having the Defense Nuclear Safety Board representative always testify to this committee as the government kind of internal watchdog that's paid to review and just monitor these things independently, just so we can hear from them. Because I think it is one of our critical missions as a committee is to be a watchdog ourselves and champion all the good work the lab does, of course, and appreciate the economic impact, but to really be focused on the security, public safety issues. So I don't know if there's time at the next committee meeting, but otherwise it would be great to hear from them. And I want to just follow up. I was reading, as you were testifying, I was reading the local inspector's report from mid-August, where they mentioned that in your final review of the glove box incident, that you had recommended 12 additional safety concerns / recommended improvements to that area. And I'm curious if those had been made.
Yes, in fact, many of them were implemented. The ones that could be implemented very quickly were already implemented. There's also recommendations that are longer term. You mentioned, the fact that one would like to be able to, have some sort of predictive ability to replace gloves before they fail. And so there's some work to do, going forward also to fully implement all of those things. But we've taken a number of steps. And in fact, we have seen the benefits already of that in, more recent instance where there was sort of a unexpected release of a glove. The prompt and correct action by all the staff mitigated any concerns in terms of contamination. So I think a lot of the communication that we did with staff about, how to deal with things that may arise has better equipped them. And as I said, we've seen benefits already in terms of improvements that have occurred since then. So it's always our goal to try and learn what we can from things that happen so that we prevent reoccurrence. And I think we're seeing some positive impacts from the changes that we made.
Okay. Well, I'll just close, Madam Chair, because I know time is short. I'm also very interested in how the DOE Order 140.1, if I have that right, that potentially could have limited some of the transparency for the safety board, as well as transparent communication from Lanol or from them to the public about safety concerns, how that has progressed, and are there any concerns?
Well,
Yes.
I won't comment on the broader questions of how the Defense Board interacts with the Department of Energy writ large in Washington, but I will say that I think we have a very transparent and professional relationship between our staff and the local inspectors, and we work very hard to make sure they have all the information they need to do their job effectively, and we value their input.
Thank you. Madam Chair, for me, in our little role as an oversight committee, and on behalf of the committee, the community and citizens, and it would be great if there was some sort of analysis on how we ramp up in terms of pit production, what are the safety deficiencies, and try to make sure that the lab, if this work is going to be done there, that the lab have the resources it needs to do so safely for itself and for the community. We'll talk about environmental cleanup later and the deficiencies with the consent order and the chromium spill and everything else. But yes, I will just thank you, Dr. Mason, for your work. I mean, I know you've got a big mission there, and obviously goes without saying, we appreciate much of the good work that happens there. So thank you, and let's continue to work on these safety issues. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And that's all we have for questions right now. Dr. Mason, thank you for joining us this morning. We really appreciate your presentation and all the information that you've provided. For the committee, we will take a quick break and reconvene in about at 11:30. And so we'll start with the next presentation from Ms. Stringer and Mr. Hoffman. I know that they're already on the call, so I appreciate that. So yeah, take a break, grab some coffee, and we'll be back in about in a little over 10 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the committee.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and begin the next agenda item, which is with Mrs. Stringer and Mr. Hoffman. Feel free to begin when you're ready.
Good morning. This is Stephanie Stringer. Okay, there's my slides. Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all today. I've been asked to provide an update on NMD's progress on the compliance order on consent. So if you can please move to the next slide. So in some of the notes about the request, just making sure I was meeting the expectations of the committee, one question came up regarding resources. So I am the director of the Resource Protection Division at the New Mexico Environment Department, and that includes the Petroleum Storage Tank Bureau, the Hazardous Waste Bureau, the Solid Waste Bureau, and the Department of Energy Oversight Bureau. So those are the programs within my division. The work that is conducted for the LANL consent order is primarily done in the Hazardous Waste Bureau. So you can see here kind of the resources that I have to devote to this project, as well as overseeing all of the hazardous waste management across the state. So there are limitations with our resources. Historically, we've been limited with funding for this bureau. Last year, there was a fee increase that went into effect, so I'm hoping that that provides some level of stability to build up resources within the Hazardous Waste Bureau. But you can see that there's not a lot of staff devoted to these really important activities across the state. So specifically within the LANL group of the Hazardous Waste Bureau, I've got 6 full-time positions right now. 3 of those are vacant. And so we're trying to fill those as quickly as we can to make sure that this important work is continuing. So a lot of phone calls coming in right now for some reason, so I apologize for that interruption. Just want to make sure that this is important context for the rest of my presentation, so letting you know that this is a constraint. I can't manage all of the Hazardous Waste Bureau across the state equally if I'm prioritizing certain areas like LANL or Kirtland Air Force Base cleanup activities. If I've got a lot of resources devoted to those projects, then other parts of the state are suffering. But yeah, just making you aware of that situation. This bureau covers, Department of Energy facilities that are huge, down to the really tiny oil changing places that manage used oil or battery acids and those types of things. So it's a very important bureau, so I want to make sure you all know the needs that we have there. So moving on to specifically the consent order. Next slide, please. I want to give you an update. So I didn't want to reiterate what I had presented to the committee last time I was in front of you all. So I just provide this link for, the members of the public who might be looking into this, and just a reminder that I gave more background the last time I presented, and I don't want to just keep telling you the same thing over and over again. So if you want more of that background, you can refer to my previous presentation that I provided to this committee for more details on the regulatory authority and those types of things. Next slide, please. Okay, super quickly, the regulatory authority. We're talking here today about the June 2016 consent order and agreement. The formal title is Compliance Order on Consent. That's the mechanism that NMED currently has for enforcing cleanup of the legacy waste at LANL. There are other components of hazardous waste management that are governed by the Hazardous Waste Facility Permit, and the consent order distinguishes, which is covered under which authority. So it's an important distinction that I want to make, that the consent order isn't everything that we're doing. So the legacy cleanup activities are organized by campaigns, and they use a risk-based approach. There's 17 identified campaigns that the consent order is driving, and there's a process that I'll get into the details here to explain how that progresses throughout the year. Next slide, please. So since in the last couple of years under federal fiscal year 2019. This is just a brief capture of, a summary overview of things that have been completed. We can go into the details. We've got documents that provide that level of detail, but just as a general overview, federal fiscal year 19, all of the milestones were, or 17 of the milestones were completed. 2 extensions were granted. 1 extension was denied. I'm looking at all of the extension requests very carefully. I want to make sure that we're making good judgment calls to not slow down progress and send the message that we're not going to blindly, give you extensions. There's got to be a good justified reason, and that's spelled out in the consent order, that there has to be good reason to allow those extensions. So definitely looking at those very closely to make sure the justification exists. We did deny 1 extension, and as a result, there were penalties that we collected due to a portion of a milestone not being completed. In addition to those sort of enforceable components of the consent order, there's constantly other activities that are going on. So in fiscal year 2019, we received 71 additional deliverables that sort of support and feed into all of the cleanup activities. So groundwater monitoring reports, work plans, and those types of things that are all supporting all of that work for achieving the milestones and making progress. So for federal fiscal year 20, which we're wrapping up now in September 30th, we had, for this year, 17 milestones were selected. New targets were established, and that's kind of the process where each year we identify the next year's milestones and then project out what those targets should be to ensure progress. So that, I don't have the full data for everything that's been completed. That I usually present that at the annual milestone meeting, which will occur later this year, probably November, December timeframe. And that'll explain exactly what was accomplished and go into more detail for what was accomplished in the previous year and explain what the plan is for future years. So we're in the middle of that process right now. We did receive the plan that DOE put together for proposed milestones for next year. I must say we were significantly disappointed in the proposal. I know there's, budget limitations that are driving some of this, but we definitely want to see a more robust plan. So last week when we had our first round of negotiation meetings, we were very clear that it was a pretty weak proposal. So we're working through that process now as we speak. Next slide, please. So just to also explain that in addition to the consent order, there are other regulatory authorities that are into play and work that's being done for managing the hazardous waste at the entire Llano facility. So I mentioned this before, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act hazardous waste facility permit drives a lot of those activities. In addition to that, there's the federal facility compliance order, and that incorporates an annual site treatment plan so that we know exactly what waste is on site and the disposition pathway expectations for that, and ensuring that NMED gets notified properly of when the waste is moved around on site. And there was a violation of the federal facility compliance order in this past year. Actually, it's a series of violations over previous years that we wanted to make sure we were holding Llano accountable to meet those expectations that are established in the federal facility compliance order. And there were some violations and associated penalties for that, around $225,000 in penalties. So I think that's the last slide. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. And I know Stephen has his sorry, I do have one more slide, next steps. Should be looking at my notes, I suppose. So compliance oversight, I mentioned, we're making sure with the resources that we have that we're overseeing the regulatory requirements, consent order requirements, and any other legal requirements that we are obligated to make sure are being completed appropriately. I mentioned the penalties that we've assessed over the last 18 months for various violations. And I've seen changes at the lab that, this is the process. When we notice these things, we call a facility out and we expect changes in behavior and the requirements to be met. So, that's our job as a regulatory agency. In addition to that type of oversight, we did just complete the annual RCRA inspection last month. So they're still working on the final report for that, and just continuing to monitor compliance requirements. Collaboration. I can't believe I forgot. I had this slide. So I've been trying to have quarterly community engagement meetings that are really driven by topics that the community wants to hear about. Because of COVID, there was not a community engagement meeting over the summer when everything was nobody knew how long this was going to last. So I was remiss in that regard. So I want to make sure I do one this fall. I'm trying to make that happen in early October. So you'll see information coming out about that meeting and looking for topics. So if you have a particular topic you want to dive deeper into, definitely email me and we can have the right people there to talk about those topics that you're most interested in. That's the purpose of the community engagement meetings, is to provide the community with an opportunity to really have a more in-depth, productive discussion on what you guys want to know about, what the community as a whole wants to know about. So looking forward to that. I was very disappointed that we couldn't have one over the summer. In addition to the community engagement meetings, there's various opportunities that are led by Los Alamos National Lab, one of which is stakeholder technical working group meetings. So my staff participate in those, and they're working through, in-depth discussions to figure out technical issues to proceed with appropriate cleanup and getting to that final point where we can say everything is cleaned up. And then in the annual planning process, this is the process that I mentioned that we're going through each year. We look at what the work, we look at the work to be done for the next year, including establishing milestones, which are enforceable activities that are required to be completed under the consent order, and then planning out for future years with establishing new targets. So NMED is going to accept nothing less than a fully funded, robust plan that ensures timely cleanup of legacy waste. So, that's a challenge given the funding situation, but that's our expectation, is we want this project to proceed. A commitment was made when the consent order was established to complete this in a timely way. Each year, the laboratory is required to give us an end date for when they expect all of the cleanup to happen. And, it's my job to make sure we're not extending that year out. So that's going to be my directive going through this process that we're already in. And I think that's what the community expects as well. So now that should be all of my slides. And I either transition over to Stephen or take questions. I'm not sure which order we're going in. But thank you all for the opportunity to share that information with you.
Thank you, Ms. Stringer. And we'll go next to Mr. Hoffman, and then if we can do questions when Mr. Hoffman's done. So go ahead, Mr. Hoffman, when you're ready. I think we're having problems with your audio. You might be on mute. In the meantime, I did send out a message to you all. We'll be breaking at 12:30 for lunch. So if you have any questions, feel free to text me if the hand isn't working for you all. and we'll get you on the list. So far, we don't have anyone, so just whenever.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. I'm going to turn the audio on my computer down to cut down on the reverb. Would you say something, please, so I can check from my phone?
Yeah. Can you hear? Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay.
I
Awesome.
can hear you. I apologize for that. But we've got good audio. Can you see me okay? All right. I am going to jump in and just say thank you, Stephanie, for the nice introduction. And thank you to Madam Chair for inviting us to present to this group. We look forward to this event every year. And as a preface to my remarks today, I'd like to touch on the steps that we at EMLA have taken to do our part to manage this COVID situation here in New Mexico and to keep our workforce safe. Last March, we suspended most in-office work and nearly all field activity. Like most organizations in the same situation as we were. We did this to flatten the curve and to keep our people safe and control how we do the work and continue doing that work. So for most of March, we focused on developing the approach and the controls we would use and then testing how well they would work. We maintained that essential functions such as inspections, inventory checks, facility functions, and emergency management and safety coordination. We implemented temperature screening steps and ensured they would work and that we could accomplish with appropriate physical distancing the work that we needed to do, as well as expanded use of personal protective equipment, much like the rest of our colleagues here in the state. We added more activities as we gained confidence in our practices, all consistent with the plans and requirements provided by our governor and her agencies. So we started some ground and surface water sampling and treatment activities as after that phased reentry began, and we completed some radioactive waste shipments to the waste isolation plant in Carlsbad and other offsite facilities for permanent disposal. This reduced our inventory, which is a big part of our mission, and it also provides us the future capacity for waste that may be generated and processed in the future. We look forward to adding more field activities when we're able to move from phase 1 into phase 2 and eventually phase 3, which will be the normal operations, all of that, of course, in the future. And to eventually start and ramp up new waste processing and repackaging operations so more shipments are possible. We're working on plans and procedures and equipment to control that work and to do it in a timely way in preparations for that operations in early next year. Overall, phase 1 process has been very effective at protecting our employees and their families and the broader community where we live and where they live. So I'll discuss some of the work that we've been able to accomplish since March in a moment. Just wrapping up this discussion on COVID, this represents a new challenge for us, but our integrated safety approach can be applied here and this hazard, and it has been, and this is how we come to establish our controls and to appropriately manage these risks. So I'm sure this parallels your workplaces as well as the processes all of us apply in our family life. It is great to be here in New Mexico. We feel like the governor and her staff have done a great job to manage these risks. The state's doing very well across the spectrum of other states, and we do take this very seriously to keep our teams safe. Now, moving on to update you on two major focus areas of our program. We've been, I'm going to speak about chromium and then Middle DP Road site. So first, I'd like to tell you about recent developments in our chromium plume intermeasure. So our chromium plume intermeasure is an active pump and treat system. It's been in place for some time now. The system extracts groundwater, treats it, removes the chromium as a target contaminant, and then re-injects that clean water back into the ground. So it's re-injected at the periphery of the plume to arrest the migration of the plume, or potentially even reverse it. The system was in operation prior to March, and we shut down in March after consultation with our colleagues at the New Mexico Environment Department and our neighbors at San Ildefonso Pueblo. Later, after confirming we could operate the system and keep our employees safe, we restarted the southern and eastern boundary of the intermeasure over the past several months. And when you turn off an active pumping system like this, it's common to see contaminant levels increase when you resume. This rebound to a higher concentration value is the pattern we've observed when the system has been shut off in the past for maintenance. But the levels do drop quickly once the active pumping restarts. Rebound is a measure of how much contaminant is still in the subsurface groundwater system, and in most cases shows the rate of dissolution that may be happening. So there's a good news story here. The chromium levels in the plume did not rebound this time the way they have in the past, which was an unexpected surprise. After our 3-month pause in extraction, the chromium levels remained below the regulatory standard when we restarted the system and then tested contaminant levels. And this is a big deal. This is a promising indicator that our intermeasure is working effectively. We're evaluating this in more detail before we get ahead of ourselves as the pumping proceeds, but the lack of rebound is a very good indication that our system is making a dent in the chromium levels. And that's exactly the goal of this overall chromium campaign, to remove the chromium so the groundwater system is restored. We have a plan for the system be in full operation by the end of September. And while I know we aren't finished with our work on this part of our program, the results are very encouraging. So now I'd like to turn on to the second focus area, which is that we've been actively working on this year, Middle DP Road site. This site wasn't even part of our mission until this spring. It's actually 2 development parcels along an area that's between the historic town site and DP Road, DP standing for Defense Programs, where the laboratory consolidated chemical operations in the 1950s and 60s. Part of the parcel is being developed by a private developer as an apartment complex for seniors, and in the process of digging a trench for a new utility line, the developer encountered some historical debris that had laboratory markings. So Lano did some initial investigating and assisted in initial response, and now our office, EMLA, is developing a more comprehensive plan to evaluate and address the whole site as it, to ensure it's well characterized and remediated as necessary. And in one particular portion of the development site, we completed a 280-foot utility trench and handled any residual debris that was encountered. For this trench, none of the debris discovered was above residential standards, which is encouraging, but there's more to do. Near term, we're planning to do some additional characterization on that portion of the property to ensure the developer can proceed with future excavations for the planned building's foundation. So this work is planned for September and October going forward. Now, on the other areas of the site, EMLA is preparing a preliminary screening plan. This is done under Section 10 of our compliance order on consent that was mentioned earlier by Stephanie. We've got a December submittal date to NMED for their review and comment. The actual investigation is expected to begin early next year, and so we're looking forward to that beginning in earnest. These are just two of the projects we've been working on to address, and while there's extra safety considerations right now, we are making progress. And in closing, I'd like to note that we're eager to define and accomplish the best balance of environmental remediation that we can support with the budget appropriated to us for our program. We're monitoring the federal budgeting process now, and we'll plan to work based on the authorization and appropriation we're given. Most of you know that continuing resolution situation is likely this coming year. So our budget for fiscal year 21 is not yet set in stone. We'll continue to work with Stephanie and her team at New Mexico Environment Department to define a range of milestones that can be accomplished in fiscal year 21, and then build off the work that we've accomplished to complete, the work we've completed in this year. We're on track to complete all commitments this fiscal year, and that's the trend we want to maintain. So thank you very much for your attention today. I know this format is challenging for everyone, but I am grateful for the opportunity to describe some of our progress here. I'll pause and turn back to you, Madam Chair, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. And we have a couple people on the list. First, we have Representative Alcon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can't see me, but I can see you. I hope you can see me and hear me. My question is on the legacy waste, especially in my area here in Cibola and McKinley County. Most of the what you would call the old mine sites, uranium mine sites that were left behind and have not been cleaned out since 1950. Most of these were produced because they were producing uranium for the Department of Defense. So my question is, why is not the Department of Defense putting up any money or any funding to clean up these legacy waste piles? Anybody? Could you hear me?
It's outside the charter of the legacy cleanup here in Los Alamos, but Stephanie may have some insight to that.
This is Stephanie, Madam Chair. Representative Alcon, I can't speak to why the Department of Energy is not, I guess it's different entities that you're speaking about, the mining industry. To answer your question, I don't, that's not part of my purview as the regulatory authority. I just make sure they're cleaning up the hazardous waste components, and that does not actually include the radioactive elements of a lot of the contamination that exists. We're limited to what's defined as hazardous substances. And so the EPA oversees a lot of the radioactive elements of these contaminated sites. I know of a few examples that we've been working closely with EPA when there's a hazardous component to them. But I don't think I can provide a specific answer to your question, Representative.
Well, this is my 12th year in the legislature. And before this, I was discussing this cleanups, and there was a study done right about year 11 or 10 that I was in the legislature, and they defined about 18 different stockpiles or legacy sites that are scattered throughout the area. And every year I have been told by whoever the Secretary of Environment is that it is very important that the cleanup of this legacy mine cleanup is important and a priority to every one of them. Well, this is year 12, and I still see that apparently on somebody's list it's a priority, but on somebody's list it's not a priority to accomplish anything. And when I'm talking about this, because like I say, I mean, when I went to a nuclear energy task force, and I think Representative Brown was there with me, Department of Defense was there, and I asked them, and they said they were aware of it, but that nobody had ever approached him or even said anything about this. This was, how long ago was that, Catherine? About 10 years ago? I don't remember. That was a long time ago. And we're still sitting here in Cibola and McKinley County looking at all of this piles of waste that are still sitting there, and nobody has tried to do anything with them. So that's just my question. Why isn't Department of Defense being asked to come up with some kind of funding to help clean up the mess that was produced to provide uranium so that they could have weapons for the future at that time, which is the future is now today. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. If you want to mute, yeah. Okay, so next we have Representative Chandler.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you, presenters, for your information. I really appreciate you being here and providing that information. One of my big issues here as a resident of Los Alamos County, I think Ms. Stringer knows this pretty well, is the cleanup of legacy waste and also non-legacy waste. It may be a better characterization for that term, but I am concerned about that, and I would like to ask Mr. Hoffman, how many shipments from January of 2020 have made their way off the hill to WIP?
Yes, ma'am. And Madam Chair, thank you for that question. We've had 5 shipments this year in transuranic waste. Of course, we ship many, many more number of shipments of low-level waste and mixed low-level waste, but I believe your question was regarding transuranic waste. So we've had 5 to the waste isolation pilot plant.
Madam Chair, Mr. Hoffman, thank you for that answer. 5 in 9 months. So that's fewer than 1 a month. Do I have that right, Mr. Hoffman, Madam Chair?
Yes, Madam Chair, and ma'am, yes, indeed, that is correct. And I think the question I hear you asking, which is a very legitimate question, at what point is the pace of shipments going to accelerate? And we too are very interested in that. We have done 2 things to facilitate an increase in our shipment rate. First, our contractor of record, N3B, when they first came on board about 2.5 years ago, very quickly brought up to speed a capability for mobile loading, which we use for all 5 of our shipments. We also have been working very well with our colleagues in NNSA at one of their facilities that's an indoor shipping ability, and that's at this rate we've gotten all of the details ironed out, and I believe one of the upcoming shipments that we have will beta test that, and then that will allow us to move. Like, for example, we had a shipment scheduled for tomorrow that had to be canceled due to the heavy winds of yesterday and this morning. And so obviously the mobile loading is a good asset, but it's better to have a backup. And so this indoor shipping would not be impacted. So that's what we're working on, so that in the future, because we're with you, we want to increase the pace of transuranic waste shipment, and those are two things that we're doing to make that future a reality.
Thank you for that answer, and Madam Chair, thank you. Can I follow up on that, please, a little bit? How many shipments have, and when you talk about shipments, are you talking about legacy waste, Mr. Hoffman and Madam Chair?
Yes, Madam Chair, and ma'am, yes, indeed. These are all legacy waste.
Okay.
We have drums of transuranic waste in our Area G above ground that are, many of which, prepared and vetted, ready for shipments. So that's in our scope, and it's, yes, legacy waste. That is waste born before 1999. And just to follow up on our planned increase, we do have 30 waste shipments planned for the upcoming year. And again, so we're looking to greatly increase the rate of shipment.
How many, thank you for that answer, Madam Chair. And Mr. Hoffman, how many barrels, just give me a rough estimate of how long it will take to remove all of the legacy waste if we actually meet your 30 shipment, excuse me, because I know it's more than a barrel. Let's say 30 shipments a year. How long will it take to remove all of the legacy waste from Los Alamos?
We have a schedule for 6 years to accomplish shipment of the above ground waste, as well as the below ground identified legacy waste, which we need to retrieve and in some cases repackage and prepare for shipment. But our schedule has us finishing that shipment of legacy transuranic waste in 2027.
Madam Chair, Mr. Hoffman, how many shipments have made their way from Idaho to WIP from January to the present?
Yes, Madam Chair, ma'am, I am unable to say with certainty how many that is.
Can you give me a guess? I don't need certainty.
Actually, I don't even track on a daily basis the shipments from other sites. We have the shipment schedules, but I don't follow up on what transpires at other locations. We've just got our head down, hustling, trying to do influence what we have control over here locally.
Yeah, Mr. Hoffman, I think Mrs. Stringer wants to respond to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Chandler, I monitor the schedules of the shipments that go into WIP, and I would say roughly two to three shipments are scheduled each week from Idaho on average.
Okay. Madam Chair and Ms. Stringer and Mr. Hoffman, so if I do that simple math, 2 times 52, that's over 100 shipments a year from Idaho. And what we're talking about now is a goal of 30. That's not a goal. It would be nice to see if we actually make that goal this year. Madam Chair and Ms. Stringer, I frankly find that unacceptable. Let me ask you this question, Mr. Hoffman. We have legacy waste. We also have waste that's being generated continually by the lab that is also accumulating. Do we have any idea of how much waste is accumulating as a result of ongoing current operations? Post what, 1995, I think, Madam Chair and participants, is that the cutoff date for characterization?
Yes, Madam Chair and ma'am, 1999 is the cutoff date. You're correct in that, and that new generation waste indeed is developed by our colleagues in NNSA. I won't speak to the exact volume of that, but I will say that we partner very well with them. For example, this indoor shipping capability that we're working on, we're working it so that both of us can benefit from this, so that when we do send a shipment, it's not just ours or theirs, but it's the most efficiently developed use of the space on that in those shipping containers. And so we both look to benefit from not just the number of shipments, but partnering with one another and optimizing the space on the shipments that we get.
Thank you for that answer, Madam Chair. And Ms. Stringer, what is, I hope you share my concern about the lack of, or let me just say, slow progress. I guess 5 barrels a year isn't lack of progress. That's 5 barrels. But maybe what is the state's strategy, Ms. Stringer and Madam Chair, as to how we're going to maybe push DOE and EM along a little bit to accelerate the cleanup of our site here? Do we have a strategy?
Madam Chair, Representative can't say that today. Representative Chandler, we do have a strategy. You know, it's certainly multi-pronged. We're taking every avenue we can to try to expedite the cleanup in many ways. I'm sure you've seen some of the comments that we've provided through the EIS process that speak to these other states getting pretty robust deals being made with the Department of Energy to ensure their waste is getting shipped. You know, we want to make sure we're at the table for those conversations. We're an important stakeholder as the host state for the waste isolation pilot plant, and we want to make sure that we're getting that same treatment and prioritization for removing the waste off the hill. So, you know, that's one component of our strategy. And I think more importantly, through the annual planning process, we're pushing for that progress to not slow down at all, to make sure the cleanup continues and then subsequently the waste is removed off the hill. So making sure that we're pushing very, very hard and demanding a robust cleanup plan that includes the disposal of the waste as part of that, to require that they stay on track to remove the waste.
Okay, Madam Chair and Ms. Stringer. So you're demanding. That's nice. Help me understand how we can enforce demand. So, Madam Chair, Idaho, I believe, has an agreement because why? They sued the state of Idaho. Is that not right, Ms. Stringer and Madam Chair?
Excuse me, Madam Chair, Representative, yes, they did pursue litigation to get those outcomes.
And so we say we want a seat at the table, Madam Chair and Ms. Stringer, and all that's great. What's the motivator to give us the seat at the table? I'm trying to understand that. Help me understand how that's going to work, Madam Chair, Ms. Stringer.
Madam Chair, Representative, if I understand your question, how does our strategy get to that point is, I think, what you're asking. We're asking for it doesn't mean we're going to be giving it, right. You know, we're exploring a lot of options to get to that point. One of them is, you know, making sure we're stating that expectation to be brought to the table, but we're also considering other means by which we can come to the table. And so some of those are still sort of being explored at this point, but I assure you that every option is on the table. You know, whether it goes to that level remains to be seen, but it's very disappointing when we see other states getting these results. And so, yes, we'd have to take some lessons from those experiences and apply them here in New Mexico.
Madam Chair, Representative, is it all right if I jump in and Secretary Kenny?
Yeah, Secretary Kenny, I was actually going to ask if you would be interested in chiming in on this.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Madam Chair. And I appreciate Steve's commitment to being here and talking and speaking on behalf of what's happening at Lanol. And we are always appreciative when DOE or any entity is going to move towards a more robust means of compliance. However, I think I've made it clear many times over in speaking with DOE that the prioritization of Los Alamos is of most importance to New Mexico. The prioritization to DOE seems to be Idaho and Savannah River. And if you look at those, the way in which those, Representative Chandler, you hit the nail on the head with the number of shipments going to WIP from other states right now. It's of great concern to us. And if we're to follow the pattern that other states use, that would mean we would have to litigate with DOE to bring New Mexico into the running to get prioritization. We hold the geologic repository here in New Mexico. We should be the priority by which that legacy waste is moved there. And we're not. And that's been an ongoing source of conversation. We are not opposed to reevaluating the consent order as we've started the process in January, talking to the community about what their needs are. But we're seeing more and more that we're trending towards an impasse on the movement of legacy contamination from Los Alamos. I hope that people hear me saying this, that if that's our only option, then that's an option we're going to explore, and we're going to need to figure out how to do that in a way that yields a better result for New Mexico. Because right now we're at the bottom of the list, and that is unacceptable.
Madam Chair, I will close. I don't want to beat this horse but I do want to encourage. I've had many conversations with you, Secretary, on this point, and I very much appreciate your commitment to making this happen. But it has to happen. I mean, we talk a lot. Every meeting, one of these meetings, Madam Chair, I bring this up and I get the same answer almost. And at a certain point, we just have to do it. You know, I would encourage the department and the administration to really assess its litigation options if that seems to be the only thing that gets the Department of Energy's attention. And I hate to say that. I was a defense lawyer my entire career, but at a certain point, you have to follow through on this. Otherwise, your encouragement, demands, desires are just that, and there will be no action unless we actually follow through, because that seems to be the only thing that the Department of Energy values, and that's very unfortunate. But thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Stringer and Mr. Hoffman. I'll pass on the questioning to someone else.
Thank you, Representative, and also thank you, Secretary, for answering. Next, we have Senator Steinborn.
Madam Chair, getting the technology to work here. Everybody, good to be with you. Ms. Stringer, Mr. Hoffman. You know, as I listen to all of this, it just feels like once again we're just treading water on, and in fact, I feel like we're losing ground in some respects on the safety issues that that are being put on New Mexico with increased pit production, these legacy waste issues that I don't feel like we're making real headways on the chromium spill. And I'm basing a lot of those comments on the presentations we've had in multiple years and listening to the rate of progress from Mr. Hinsey, I guess Mr. Hoffman, perhaps your predecessor, and that it feels like the chromium issue, literally based upon the progress he laid out, could take decades. Literally 3 decades from now, we could be having the same conversation. And I know that there's other items on the list to clean up there in that region with the word watershed next to it that haven't even begun to be undertaken. And so, so I strongly believe that New Mexico needs to change our strategy. And if we continue to say to the federal government, well, take whatever pace is comfortable for you, appropriate whatever little amount of money is also comfortable for you, then you will get exactly the result you have asked for, which is low expectations because there's no higher expectation. And I think New Mexico, we owe it to our state and our citizens to demand the utmost urgency, speed with protecting our environment, and in return for what we do for the country. So I think I do believe that the state should go back to the drawing table on the consent order, and that feels like that is our primary point of leverage, certainly on all these legacy cleanup issues. But it's not just about getting the waste off the hill, and I know that that's a big issue for people locally, of course, and for all of us. But for all of these cleanup issues, I feel like Department of Energy ought to double the budget, frankly, for what they're spending to do this cleanup. I mean, we have billions and billions and billions to expand the mission, but yet we are continuing to shortchange the cleanup. And I just think those priorities are kind of messed up. So Mr. Secretary, and I really appreciate your vigilance to these issues around the state and trying to protect New Mexicans. And when it comes to this issue, I add my voice. And we've talked about it many times, but I would like to see us get back to the drawing board on the consent order, and that New Mexico, establish a very high bar for what we expect to be cleaned up, the timetable, and ascribe penalties to that when that doesn't occur, similar to what we had prior to this consent order that was created during the Martinez era. So that's how I feel. Without going into the details of the rate of the chromium spill, I don't think anything's changed from previous discussions, and listening to the seeming low priority of New Mexico's waste relative to non-New Mexico waste. That's also really troubling. So that's my 2 cents, Madam Chair. And I would like to see us rip up the consent order and become a tougher negotiator for New Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Is there anyone else who would like, Representative Brown? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have a little hand icon on my screen, so I'll just wave at you. I have WIP in my legislative district, and I do not represent the Department of Energy. But I just want to put it out there that there are many facets to this picture, and there are certain waste acceptance criteria that have to be met. And I know that we all know that LANL made some mistakes in the past. And so I think there's a lot more discussion to be had here. And so I just would consider asking that the committee hear from perhaps the Department of Energy about the consent order at some time and get its perspective on why it is the way it is here regarding the LANL waste. And I too want to see the LANL waste come down to WIP. It's a very complicated situation. Lots of things to consider. And so I think the committee would probably benefit from hearing from some other voices on this. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on this issue? Okay. Well, you all, thank you so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon. I know that there's a lot of questions on this issue around the consent order, and then just what the future holds for New Mexico, and a lot of what we're currently really just holding on to. And I know that from the perspective, there's a lot of different perspectives on this committee, particularly because of just places that we represent, but I think it is necessary. I do believe that the Department of Energy was a part of a conversation around this last year. I'm trying to remember, but I know that I do have similar concerns that others have raised in terms of the lack of prioritization when it comes to this issue. And I know that moving forward, there will be, I think, a lot of conversation around this issue and making sure that something be done. I would hope that that Secretary and others, if there's things that we can do on our end on the legislative side to help push this effort forward, especially if you all are thinking about going back to the drawing board, that you lean on us and see how we can be supportive in those efforts, because this is a very huge priority for many of us, particularly those in that represent the communities where a lot of this legacy has really not only impacted the environment, but just communities as a whole when it comes to issues around public health. And so I just to reiterate that. So thank you all for joining us this morning, this afternoon. We're going to be breaking for now. We'll reconvene at 1:15. And if there's any other questions, then we'll see you all then.
Thank you very much. We're out.